So, here we are. And once again, it's up to you. Do you have anything left? This is probably our almost last chance of this kind of conversation. It doesn't have to be anything that we've talked about. Oh, look, he's waving his arm. I don't have to keep asking. Yes, Nara?
I'd love to hear your, there's probably many, but your favourite story out of Autobiography of a Yogi.
Ah, yes.
My favorite story out of Autobiography of a Yogi?
Or your favourite message, your favourite...
Phew. Okay. Did anyone... Ishani, I'm going to disturb you. Did you ever figure out what that guy's question was? Remember in South Africa, I wanted to know what his last question was? After he asked me if I'd ever seen Babaji, which we just passed right over. What was the one after that?
He asked about Babaji coming into meditations or helping you through things.
No, that was the first one. But he asked about some incident in the autobiography. No one remembers.
I don't think it was about the autobiography.
Okay, then I'll just forget it. Maybe I hallucinated it.
Maybe you said something about it in your answer, but his question
was just that. Okay. Then I can't call on that one because I can't even remember what it was. I think, and this is not really a story in the autobiography, but it is words in the autobiography, is the last two lines of the poem Samadhi. A tiny bubble of laughter, I have become the sea of mirth itself. I think that one has really, really helped me to understand what the spiritual path is. I love thoughts are not individual but universal. And I read the book cover to cover last August. I took a whole month of seclusion last August. I thought I was going to start writing a book. I didn't. After I finished Lightbearer, I had all my notes for that book on paper, partly because I started before there was a computer. But I can't think when it's just on the computer. I have to have something that I can hold. And so after I finished that book and went through must have been 10 or 12 banker's boxes of paper, there was just a pile left, about this much, that didn't fit into that book. So I took it with me on holiday and on seclusion, and I just read through it looking for the next book and sorted it out. It's what happened when Swami wrote. He wrote The Path, he wrote The Essence of Self-Realization, then he wrote a biography of Yogananda. No, he wrote the biography afterwards, I think. Yeah. And so he wrote The Essence and The Path, and then he had a bunch of stuff left over, and that's when he wrote Conversations with Yogananda, which is just all the way through, random anecdotes. Basically, I have that same book, but I didn't get started writing because it took me the whole time I was there just to read the notes and sort through them. But I think it's a nice book. I might try to write it this summer. And then there was about 2 years where I carried a tape recorder. I stopped doing it because it inhibited things to have a tape recorder in the middle of the room, and but I have about 200 tapes. Not all of them are long, and Rambakta has been using the automatic transcription and then sorting it. So I also have all of that. So anyway, that has nothing to do with autobiography except that I went to there and I had a whole month to myself, and so I just opened autobiography from the beginning, which I haven't done in a long time, and I just read it cover to cover. And then I read Mejda cover to cover. And then I read a book. It's a biography of him written by one of his childhood friends. It's awful. I can't remember the name of it. Swami did not like it at all. And this is sort of what you're saying, but not exactly. The result of reading all three of those, because the childhood companion of Master was involved in his schools. And from reading those three books, I've always known that Master, the first work Master did was to start schools for children. And one kind of just reads that in the autobiography, and you just kind of go past it because he did these schools, and then he had the vision, and then he left. And so it feels so outside of what you think of as his work. But both reading the autobiography slowly, where you're not in a hurry to turn the page, And then Mejda, which is where Master's brother would know more about what Master did before he left for America, because he only saw him for 1 year after that. And this other, what do you call him, companion, friend, who was active in the schools the whole time. Master was extraordinarily dedicated to children's education. I mean, much more than just saying, oh, he founded schools in India. He worked in the schools, he taught the children. He ran overtime in his classes so that the other teachers' classes were sometimes cut short because Master got carried away, you know, singing and chanting with the boys. Speaking of just the impact, I just really started appreciating just the picture of Master. All this was before he was 27, because he left for America at that point. But he spent his time with young children, and was mostly boys, and was really training them in meditation and yoga postures. And somewhere there's that story about him, the boy who was really, the two boys who were fighting, and he put them in the same bed. I mean, Master was behind the headboard whacking on the children, you know, getting them to, but what I was trying to, the level of personal involvement in the individual lives of those children, and therefore the importance of setting the vibration for education for children. It's like we sort of know that. This is like there's so many things about Swami's life, and even more about Master's life, because so we have a paucity of information that we just don't know, or that we don't perceive the impact of it. Swami has said that he thought education for life ultimately would be bigger, and I think he said more important than anything else Ananda's doing. Because if you really want to change the world, you have to start with the next generation. And Swami at one point basically said it would take 2 or 3 generations of good education and right upbringing to really put the world back in order. If you want to think in terms of time, actually, that's an answer. Because you have to raise a group of children correctly, then they get to raise a group of children correctly. And by the time you're on the 3rd generation, you might begin to get the thing straightened out. So my latest reading of Autobiography of a Yogi, and I've always been very engaged in education for life. We have a school in Palo Alto. We've had it for 30 years. I was actually, and this is comical, but I actually was the admissions director of that school. And the telephone for Ananda School, which, as we called it then, was on my kitchen counter. And so every time, because this was landline era, every time that phone would ring, no matter what was going on, it would be, hello, Ananda School, this is Asha, how can I help you? You know, I'd be stirring the soup or telling everybody behind me to be quiet. And then I joke that I'm a reasonably good actress, so I don't know how to be an educator, but I know how to act like an educator. And I was very persuasive, so we managed to get going. But the point being, and we put the school right on our temple grounds, and Swami said, Master said not to put your school on your temple grounds because screaming children are highly incompatible with a meditation temple. And I said, sir, we either have a school or we don't. The only place to put it is on the temple. And so he said, well, of course, that's what you have to do. So in a very real sense, we put the project of the temple underneath the project of the school, because temples are more common than schools. So anyway, I've been in it. But even with all of that, at the school, after 7 years, the school actually became a school, really became a school. And I was not an educator. And I went to Portland, where Helen Purcell was living at the time, and she's a good friend of mine. I actually threw myself at her feet and wept and pleaded with her. She's a professional educator from elementary school through college, 50 years now. I just pleaded with her. I said, we just can't do it. We need somebody who knows what they're doing. And God bless her, she came, has been there ever since. So, and that was the result of reading Autobiography. So that was a very long, circuitous answer, but that was the actual answer. Okay? That's my latest. You see, that's the fun of this path. You get yourself all settled and you think you know it. And then you sit down and you discover something that sounds so naive. Oh, Master founded a school in India. But I never really got that Master founded a school in India. He really did. It wasn't just something to fill the time. He really threw himself into it completely, as should we. See, this is how the disciples or the devotee knows what to do next. Like even my being here in Australia, which took me almost 10 years to get here, when I was first going to start doing what Swami asked me to do, which was to travel, the first place I tried to come was Australia, because it was Swamiji's unfinished business, because he had always wanted to establish Ananda here. He came 3 or 4 times, which might not sound like that many, but in the course of Swami's travels, to come back to the same place, it was notable. And he always he stayed here usually for a while, and he always made a very serious effort. And then we actually sent people here, 6 people in the end, but nothing ever took. He finally gave up, basically. He just didn't feel like the moment was ready. But he gave up 30 years ago, so time has passed. But it's because he did it that I thought to do it. That's sort of how it always works. Yeah. Yes, Alexandra?
Did Swami ever mention New Zealand? Or did he include that in the Australian project?
Did Swami ever mention New Zealand? Everybody asks me that. No. But he did not mention it, because when I asked him, well, you say something stupid like, when I asked him when he was still living, I asked him. So he lived till 2013. He told me to start traveling in 2012. There was only a few months in there. I asked him whether, when he said I should travel the world, he meant I should come to India. He said, no, when I said world, I meant world. I mean, just India. And then I said, when you meant world, did you mean the USA? And he said, He said, I'm of 2 minds about the USA, which is exactly how I felt at that point. I was just tired of them. And he said, go where there's energy. That was his actual response. And the reason I went to New Zealand, there were good devotees here, but there was nobody who was able to take it on. You know, you can be a wonderful devotee, but the ability, having the time and the inclination and the particular contacts or what's required to organize something is a whole different issue. So there were good devotees here, but nobody was in a position to organize. And Kavita in New Zealand had actually prayed to Master to bring Asha to New Zealand, because she'd been with Master for 25 years through SRF, and just there wasn't enough happening. And she typed in Yogananda Patanjali into Google, and my face came up. And she really enjoyed that, got in touch with Ananda, and just felt correctly that we're soul sisters for many lifetimes. And she said to Master, I don't think I can get to California, you have to bring Asha here. And it was actually a few months later, I thought it was sooner, but a few months later she gets a personal email from me. Swami told me to travel, I'm trying to find places to go in English-speaking countries. And I sent the email and then she replied. I mean, I don't remember there was any difference. I just watched my email go, and then her answer came back, yes. And because I didn't know the difference that much between New Zealand and Australia, I was a little surprised to find out how teeny-weeny little New Zealand is over here. So I got there twice. This was the 3rd time before I got here.
It'll grow up one day, Asha.
Say again? It'll grow up one day. It's just a little baby Australia. It's working on it. Okay.
You know, they're going to watch this video.
And they know how much we love you, don't you? Everybody's going to watch this video. I know this. I'm used to being recorded, and we have certain leadership meetings we have had in our community, and they're not recorded. And every so often I'll look around the room and I'll say, this is not being recorded, so. Because you do have to think about that. Anything you say will go everywhere these days. You do have to be careful. Well, any other questions? The one thing other that Swami also said about New Zealanders, since you're asking, especially, is that New Zealanders tend to be very psychic. And he thought it was the Maori influence in the land itself, that there was something in the land there that made New Zealanders more attuned to the non-material world. And I actually, in my limited experience, actually not so much in New Zealand, but with New Zealanders that I've met in the US, they often are a little more conscious of non-physical realities and have unusual powers. I hadn't thought of it till he said it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The Maori have an entire approach even to the chakras as well.
Well, you know, it's not even just, yes. It's not so much what people are trying to do now, which is to go to that actual existing civilization and try to incorporate it into their reality. Swami gave a very interesting satsang, which I wrote about in Lightbearer, when he talked about uniquely American characteristics that Master incorporated into his teachings. One of them is cooperation. There's 3, and I can only ever remember 2. One of them is cooperation. I don't know what the second was, but the third one was a strong relationship with nature. And when you think about it, all Master's poetry, Master's songs, we take it sort of for granted that he's constantly making images from the natural world, but it's not necessarily that way at all. In fact, St. Francis was the first deeply religious Westerner to actually celebrate God in nature. His Canticle of the Creatures was a landmark piece of liturgy, because before then, creation was separate. You know, this was the material world, and then there was the spiritual world. So Master's complete embrace of the natural world and constantly seeing it as a symbol of the divine. And then Swamiji said that the native people of what is now the country of the United States, they left their consciousness in the land. And especially, I think I was saying that in here, by the time the Europeans came to the US, the people, as they called themselves, knew that their days were over, that they remembered their golden age. So I think it's more the golden age of those people put vibrations in the soil. And Swami mentioned that even though right now people with power are ignoring those, it's bubbling up and just coming. Master said wherever great saints and masters have lived, their vibrations are there forever, which is really something to think about, which is why he went to Los Angeles, because he said great sages and masters had inhabited that land.
Wait, Master said that?
Yes. And that's why it was holy. That's why he called Los Angeles the Varanasi of the West. It certainly wasn't because of what was happening now, but the vibrations were. Swami felt that he could feel, he often would say, you know, you can feel underneath what's going on there now, this deeper, more profound. There's a tradition that Arjuna came to and lived in that part of the world. And if you think that Master was Arjuna in a previous incarnation, it just, your mind just goes, yeah. You know, you just realize that we're just children, we don't know anything. Yeah. But it's fascinating. And that's fascinating how much we are probably compelled by past life realities, by subtle energies, and we think we're just moving around in our own, according to our own will, and we're not at all. Sarada Devi, Ramakrishna's mother, was somewhere in India with a group of tourists, and she saw some foreign tourists looking at some ancient site, and she just turned to her companions and he said, 5,000 years ago they built it and now they're coming back to see it again. I travel for about 20 years, every other year, so maybe like 12 times. We took a group of mostly Americans to India on a pilgrimage tour that was very set. It was in the footsteps of Yogananda. We went to the places that were holy to Yogananda's life. And then the very last couple of years, Swami Kriyananda had moved there, so we had to shift the itinerary to see him. Let's see what's a part of it. Oh yes, and part of it was to go to the Taj Mahal, because if you've never been to India, you should go see the Taj Mahal. So I'd seen it 3 or 4 or 5 times. And then one trip we were on, we had all these men who were builders. We had Rich Bazan, you know, Diva, Michael Gornick, John Bain. There was, I think, one more. Big men who built big buildings. Or Arjuna, for some reason, might have even been on that trip. No, he wouldn't have been. But anyway, so I walked around the Taj Mahal with the people who I think built it. And I'd seen this place many times. You know, I mean, it's beautiful. It's a lovely place to be. But their perspective was just so different. I mean, they looked under things, you know. And they would comment about the geometry and what was holding it up and how that must have been hard to do. And just, you know, we all live in different worlds, even though we walk next to each other. Yeah. That's how we learn to love each other. You just realize how different we are and how it makes so much sense. In that same group, most of those men were really big men. I can't believe I actually did this, but I did this. Oftentimes the meals were a buffet, like here, and I sat at the table with all those men, and they had so much food on their plates. And I said something like, "Oh my God, look at all that food," you know, something like really, really stupid. And then John Bain says to me, "This is how big guys stay big." He said, but then I thought, and then for a while I was like, because I'm small, and relatively speaking, you know, and I function as a small person. It's like I can't go pick up big things and move them around. So I have to persuade others to do that for me, you know. So I developed other skills, that kind of thing like that. And I just began to, you know, just realize how different it is. Just even, I mean, we have an example of a very large man in the room who's really strong. How just differently you approach everything. Because they can do things that I can't do. And it's so, and I was being incredibly rude about it once, talking to Diva. Finally, Diva said to me, "Asha, I just made the body that seemed the right size for my consciousness." And I thought, okay, end of conversation. But there's a lot of, you know, learning and all of that, really deeply, because we become so hypnotized by our own perspective. And you know, that's why travel is so useful. We become hypnotized by what we do. We begin to think there's an actual reason for it, other than just random. Once when we were coming home from India on one of those trips, there were 3 women, American women, who had flown to India. This was like a service that they did. They flew to India, they went to an orphanage there, and each woman carried 2 little tiny babies back to the US because the babies had already been adopted by American families. So you see this beautiful little brown baby, and his name is Ralph John Smith, you know, because they now have their new American names. And so I said to the women, how are you going to go like this 15-hour flight with 2 babies? She said, "Watch, the whole plane will help." And she was exactly right. There wasn't one person on the plane who wasn't engaged with those little babies. And of course, you just sat there and looked at the child, and you thought about the karma. Born into what seemed to be, you know, such an inauspicious beginning, parents who couldn't take care of them, and now they're going to just be lifted up and, you know, go live in some part of the United States that not only speaks English, but speaks it with some strange, you know, twisted accent, you know, or just like, who are you? What's going to happen to you? Yeah. And then how did we end up where we ended up? None of it is random, but all of it is remarkable. Yeah.
The other night, when you were talking about a book that you had read and you really liked, and you gave it to Swami and he didn't like it, and it was about some
Anne Catherine Emmerich.
Yeah, why do you think Swami didn't like
You know, it's a very funny thing. Anne Catherine Emmerich was a German saint. I don't think she's a saint. The Catholic Church considers her a beatific, or, that she's gotten halfway to sainthood. She was a nun. As I said, she was German. She had lots of visions, lots and lots of visions about Jesus. And some person, probably a priest, though I don't know, took it upon himself to write down her visions. I mean, she had visions like, what color Mary was wearing and how the scarf was tied and what the porch looked like and what they ate for dinner and, and there's 3 volumes, they're like white, red and white books. And when you read through that, and it was I must have read it much earlier in my life with Christ. So it was just amazing to read because you really were getting like a tourist view of being there. And also with it, was a certain perspective on Jesus. Oh, that was the one where I said that she said that demons were going to be released from hell. That's why I brought it up. I loved it. I just thought it was marvelous. I'd never read anything so wonderful. And then there were 2 parts to this. And then I bought a set of the books for Swami because I just thought he would like them, not even thinking that of course he knew about them, because she's very well known. And it must have been before he rejected them, I took those books into seclusion with me because it was Easter coming up, and I thought I would at least reread parts of them because it was going to be Easter and that would give me energy. Okay, when I go into seclusion, I become more refined, basically. When I'm in the course of my everyday life, I have more diversions, just because we all do. I'm bored, I'll go out for breakfast kind of thing. But when I'm in seclusion, all of that falls away and I get much more still. So I took out those books and I tried to read them. And I felt that they put me out of tune. That's the only way I can put it. I just felt something about them did not match the vibration I was trying to be in. And it puzzled me, but I just put them aside and worked with other things. So when Swami later said that he didn't want it, he didn't like them, he never said more than that he just wasn't interested in it. He was a little bit respectful because I'd been so enthusiastic to buy them for him. But I can understand because I myself experienced it. So maybe all I enjoyed about it was, I think I might have enjoyed it not for the inspiration, but for the information. Mm. And the information was very interesting, and I feel, I don't know, it was not dissimilar to things that Therese Neumann said or Edgar Cayce. So I never felt that I had to repudiate it, but there was a lot of Catholicism in it too. And a lot of, even as I was reading it, I wonder what they left out because it contradicted Catholicism. But it was the vibration, actually, honestly. Interesting. Good question. Yes, Susie?
I was just wondering, Asha, if you could talk a bit about the birth of Jesus, where the 3 wise men were Lahiri Mahashaya, Sri Yukteswar, and Master.
So what, just the question is about Swami saying that the 3 wise men were 3 of our gurus.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you have it. It's pretty outstanding, isn't it?
Yeah.
When Swami asked Master, because he heard Master say very early on during Swami's time, Master was dictating lessons for the SRF students, and he said that the 3 wise men who visited Jesus, he said again, Babaji, Lahiri, and Sri Yukteswar. And when Jesus was 12 years old or 13 years old, he left his home and he went to India to repay the visit, and he went to the Himalayas and he studied with those masters, and he actually spent 18 years in India. This is now almost common knowledge. And he was in the Himalayas, he was in Varanasi, and he was in Puri, the Jagannath temple in Puri, specifically. And he assigned his disciple Thomas before Jesus passed, he told Thomas that his work was to go back to India. So as soon as Jesus died, Thomas went to South India, and Jesus's teachings were well established in India, but they were totally integrated into Hindu society because Jesus was another avatar, and they understood that perfectly, and he was clearly an avatar. So he drew his disciples. I said to Swami, Jesus' real work was in India. He was just in the US just long enough to die. And Swami said, yeah, in fact, that's true. And so Thomas went back and just continued that and built it up quite dynamically. And it was unique because they were followers of Isa is I think how he was called there. And it flourished for multiple centuries. And they became, but then what happened was the Portuguese arrived. And, the Portuguese were Roman Catholics, and nobody had any idea that there was this whole so-called Christian thing going on in India, and especially when the Portuguese priests saw that it was totally integrated into Indian society, they were absolutely scandalized. So there's this whole big thing where literally the priests tricked all the Portuguese tricked all the Indian Christians to come to a gathering where they were supposedly going to be harmonious, to bring their scriptures and all of that. They burned all the books and they burned all the records. They burned everything that they could burn that showed that there had ever been anything like what Thomas and Jesus created there. I present this from many sources and I believe it to be true. And then they just basically turned them all into Roman Catholics, and that was that. For a long time they called themselves Thomas Christians because they were trying to distinguish themselves. So that's that part of it. The other part of it is Swami's point of view, which is if those three masters were there, where was Yogananda? And the obvious place for Yogananda to have been in the manger, that he was the baby, Jesus. So Swami asked Master if he had been Jesus Christ in a previous incarnation. Master answered, what difference would it make? Which was not a no, and which is, if the answer was no, he would have just said no. He said, what difference would it make? And then Swami commented, we agreed that Master had enough controversy around his person. What if he'd said he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ? Can you imagine how that would have gone over? He would have been crucified again. So it just wasn't for him to say. So Swamiji, in the early years, would just kind of put all this out and let it float. Then he wrote the book he called Revelations of Christ. And by the time he finished that, he started by saying, I'm inclined to believe that Master was Jesus. By the end of his life, he was just saying Master was Jesus. He said it's just clear, and he just made it as a simple statement like that, which is all extremely interesting from the point of view of how the cosmos works. Swamiji also proposed this interesting thought that because so many of these masters, Babaji was Krishna, Yogananda was Arjuna, if Yogananda was also Jesus, Lahiri Mahashaya was Kabir, Sri Yukteswar, played different roles. It's possible that Master was also Adi Shankaracharya. That's Swami is inclined to think that. When we were on our way to Badrinath in India once, and the road was washed out, we had to spend like an extra night or two in Josimath, which is like at 7,000 feet, and Badrinath's about 11. When it snows at 11,000 feet, they bring the deities down to Josimath. But we were there by accident, our pilgrimage group. And so we went to Adi Shankaracharya's ashram, and the place where he had meditated, and I didn't even know it was there. As soon as I stepped on that ground, it just felt like home to me. I felt so like this is a place I know. That doesn't mean a great deal, but it was interesting to me that it happened. And later when Swami was talking about it all, if Master was Adi Shankaracharya, who founded the original Swami order, the fact that Swami Kriyananda reinvented The Swami order is the Nayaswami order. This is all mixed for the woo-woo music to start in the background. You know? This is the place where it begins. It just makes things interesting. You know, what would it change? It doesn't change anything. I have, for those of you who are interested, on my YouTube channel, there's a series of classes called The Inner Pilgrimage with Jesus, which I recorded after the 4th trip I took to Israel in about 5 years. And to me, it's one of my favorite things that I've ever done. And I brought together every esoteric thing that I could possibly say or know about the life of Jesus. So if it interests you, you would enjoy it. It's just free. You can just listen to it. Because traveling there and leading pilgrimages especially, which we did, going to the different places, I was mentioning it in some context about, I think it was here, about the life of Christ being something that I understand in a natural way, meaning that I know it was people not so different from us, just in the company, of course, of the great saint, but still, the dynamic was like us. And so just thinking about it that way, to my mind, it doesn't bring it down. It actually just makes the height of it more accessible, because there's no big barrier. And so trying to understand Christ from what I know about Yogananda, understanding the disciples of Jesus from what I know about Swami Kriyananda, it all becomes more accessible. So, you know, you start, when a master says something that one has absolutely no way of verifying from one's own experience, you know, it's just like there's no possible way that I could say yes to whether Babaji came, and there was some objection somewhere in there. Let me think what it was. Some previous incarnation of Sri Yukteswar, there was some kind of time overlap that was difficult. Now, how could that possibly be true? But Swami sort of raised the question, you know, we have the picture of the 3 wise men that we've just kind of absorbed as children. They rode on camels, you know, they crossed the desert, they brought packages of gold, you know, all these different things. Who knows if any of that happened? Swami said they could have come in their astral bodies for all we know. You know, it just could have been a visitation that came in light. What could stop them? For some reason, I have this thought in my mind that one of the 3 wise men was also incarnated somewhere else at the same time. I'm looking around for help, but I can't. I'm not getting it. John the Baptist. That's exactly it. John the Baptist. Yeah, John the Baptist and Sri Yukteswar. Thank you. I just like a blank, because if Jesus is Guru, if it was Master, if it was John the Baptist, if it was Elijah, Elisha, all of this, yes, that became confused. And that's where Swami just went. Small obstacle for a God-realized Master. But wait, let me finish one more thought before you all grab that one.
I just think it is also, if it's like Yogananda maybe was Jesus Christ, or who was that 12 apostles?
Who was?
12 apostles. Like Jesus have 12 apostles?
Who are the apostles?
Apostles. 12 apostles.
Who were they?
Yeah. I'm just thinking maybe Swami Kriyananda was.
Well, my own, someone once asked me, if Swami Kriyananda came back, what question would I ask him? And it was a nice question, because I said I had no unfinished business with him. We knew for a long time. He was so elderly and so unwell. We knew at any minute he could stop breathing. So, you know, you scurried to finish your business with him because you didn't know if there was a tomorrow. So I was surprised when he passed, but because he passed so suddenly, he passed in 15 minutes. I got 15 minutes, he's having trouble breathing at 11 p.m. at night. He's having trouble breathing, 11:15, he's gone. And that was the whole story in Italy, and I was in California. The end point of all of that is, the last time I saw Swami was in March of 2013. He died in April, and I was scheduled to go with him to Romania in June. So I had tickets, that was all set up. And in between there, I started studying the apostles for some reason, Easter probably. And I began to feel that the likely one for Swami to have been was Thomas. One, because Master had told Swami that in a past life you were eaten up with doubts, which is interesting. But more than that, in this lifetime, in the life of Kriyananda, Swami Kriyananda got unique special instructions from Yogananda and ended up being completely separated from all the other disciples, and he had a unique mission that he had to do that was not connected to the others. And it was directly from Yogananda. They never could give him an assignment because he already had his assignment from the Master, which was exactly what Thomas's situation is. And also from the beginning, Master kept saying to Swami, I'm going to take you to India. And so every year that Swami was with Master, they were going to go to India, which was not true for anyone else. He wasn't telling other disciples, it was just Swami who was going to do that, which is why 10 years later, when SRF itself was going to, the officers were going to go to India, that's why they sent Kriyananda, because Master had said that he wanted him to go to India. So I had that question to ask Swami, but he died before I could ask him. So I just have to say it like I don't have any idea. But the last thing I wanted to say, let me finish the thought, because this is very important for all of you. This is the part that matters. When I met Swamiji, I trusted him. I just intuitively did. There was never any issue. I always trusted him. And I trusted him personally. And I also trusted that he knew what he was talking about. And I trusted that he knew better than I did what he was talking about, which was not a mindless obedience because I just couldn't do that. So when that trust is really in place, even if they defy logic or defy anything that you can understand, or in my case, contradict what I might have thought, there's no way I can reject it. You know, I have to at least try to accept it. I have to accept it sincerely and authentically. But if I can't accept it, I can't reject it either, which is a very good attitude to take. That way you trust yourself. You know, I've had enough experience. I don't have to always be asking, is this true? Is this true? Is this real? Is this real? So, and of course I feel the same way about Master. So when he says that they were the three wise men, I can't say yes, but I dare not say no. And when Swami says he feels that Master was Jesus, and knowing him the way he is, how careful he was to express it, and watching the evolution of his statement, I can't confirm it, but I dare not reject it. And so I entertain myself by what if? And then I start understanding everything with a what if, and then generally, that's how I decide, that's how I'm able to absorb an idea that I didn't immediately understand, is that I just keep moving through my life. What if this were true? How would it affect? And that's how you expand your knowledge in an authentic way, instead of just becoming a parrot. But it has to start with respect, and it has to start with some level of trust. I've had some experience that makes me have to trust this. And you know, some of you in this room are disciples or Kriyabans, and some of you are not at all. So it's also tricky. You come into the room, you see these gorgeous pictures with these huge garlands of people who are long since out of their body. And how are you going to know anything? You can read books, you can, in some cases, you can see photographs, or you can even hear voices of Master and of Swami Kriyananda at least. But still, it's a little hard. How do I evaluate whether someone is a real master or not? How could we know? So one of the ways that you can tell is by looking at the people who follow that teaching. And I don't just mean anybody who walked in off the street, but people whose vibration is close enough to your own that you can evaluate it with the tools that you have at hand. And if they impress you, and they are dedicated to this path, they're actually telling you who the Master is. And so oftentimes when people ask, how do I find my path? How do I know who my guru is? People are always looking at the photos of the Masters, but that's often not the best way. Look around at the people who follow it. Look at the fruit. This is the question that was asked to Jesus. Look at the fruit of the Master's work and ask yourself, do I like it? You know, when you look at these people, whoever they are, would I like to be like them? Because if you would, then that's telling you who the masters are. Because you go to different ashrams of very, very different energies. Because all of Krishna's soldiers look like Krishna. Yeah.
I just got to have one more question about Jesus. I just wanted to ask you about Jesus and the Essenes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some of your teachings, you may have mentioned there's a link with the Essenes and Ananda.
Oh yeah.
If that's okay to ask that.
Uh-huh. The question is about the Essenes and Ananda. It's become common knowledge that the Essenes were an important existing group at the time of Jesus' life. We had our Israeli guide when we were traveling there just tell us there were 3 groups of Jews at the time, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. So there's nothing secret about it. They have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they have the Qumran place where they said the Essenes were. Quite honestly, some of the things that they say about the Essenes, from my experience of life in community, are kind of silly, but nonetheless, it's all right. That's what they think. Who am I to challenge them? But this was not quite this bad, but it was close. I read a novel about the Essenes, and every time anything happened, everybody went home and changed into their ritual white clothes and gathered in the formal place to talk about essentially what we're going to have for lunch. I mean, it was sort of on that level. My mind says, who does all the laundry? It's like, these people 3 times a day are changing into ritual white clothes. It wasn't real. It just couldn't have happened like that because people are people. So there's a certain, I might be presumptuous, but watching the little documentary at Qumran about the Essenes, there were parts of it that I thought, I don't think so. However, there's good source for it. What the Essenes were is the Essenes were the Sanatan Dharma remnant of Judaism. Because Judaism is a true religion. Moses, Master said, was an avatar. And the teaching is Sanatan Dharma. But over Kali Yuga descending, it gradually corrupted. But the Essenes were in touch with the truth of it. And as the corrupt priesthood, which was the Pharisees and the Sadducees, got their big giant temple and their huge golden menorah and all the things that they did and their control over that whole situation, the Essenes, with their mystical teaching, became more and more marginalized from the power and even to a certain extent underground. And it was slightly, these are all, there's bits and pieces of this. But it wasn't necessarily so popular to be in the scene. So they were a little bit secret. Or at least they were peripheral and they were out of sight. But Jesus was born into the Essene community, and almost everybody who was associated with him was one of the Essenes, because that was the group that magnetized Jesus. Because the corrupt priesthood didn't want to see him. And the minions of that priesthood and the dogmatic Jews of the time, they weren't calling an avatar, but the Essenes were. So, and then, because I've lived my whole life in a community that is out of step with the mainstream culture, that is doing something that we see very differently than the world sees, and it's not quite the lunatic fringe anymore, but it was when we started. And still, our whole community is made of people who should have been more important and more successful in the world than any of us were. I mean, we were the kind of people who were heading in that direction, but we just took a left turn. So from the point of view of our parents and many other people, we just took all our privilege and potential and threw it out the window. They see it slightly differently now, but especially at the beginning. But when I would read about the Essenes, the whole way they operated and so on, it was just Ananda. And so, a different community, very clear in its own message, very powerful in its own spirituality, very committed to its own destiny, but not at all in tune with the times. So again, experience helped me to understand that. And whether these things are true or not, I don't know, but they're interesting. Yeah. Okay. Kalamali.
Well, since we're talking about Christ, I thought maybe you could share the story of how Swami Kriyananda shared Christ lives in Oratorium inspiration came to him and he developed
Okay.
that.
There's a question about how Swami came to write the Oratorio. An oratorio is the life of Christ in music. It's a recognized art form. In the early 80s at Ananda, the community had, let's see, what was going on? The community had, we were losing our mission. Swamiji was aware of that, but none of the rest of us were. Almost like the majority, there were like 60 people in the monasteries out of maybe 120, like half the community was in the monasteries, and about a quarter of those people actually belonged in the monasteries in the sense of it really being a life calling for them. But we had begun to fall into the mindset that if you're spiritual, you'll be a brahmachari. It's just that thing, we were just falling into it. We were also falling into the idea that spiritual path is about what you should do, not about what you felt to do. Swami was quite concerned about it because he knew this wasn't why we were there. And he prayed to Master about, just what's supposed to happen here. It's supposed to be a householder community. They're all going into the monastery. He said, everything about Ananda has been defined by me. He said, but I'm a monk, and we need to have a householder community. And he felt Master say, well, you could marry. And Master said, this is how he repeated it to us later. He said, but I'm a monk. You made me a monk. And Master said, it doesn't matter. You just, you fulfilled your vow, and you fulfilled the purpose of your vow. Which led Swami first to get involved for a short period of time with this woman that he met in Hawaii, which was an adventure in the community. She was, it shocked everyone, just took everyone by total surprise because Kriyananda, we had him where he was supposed to be, and we were quite annoyed that he dared to step out of our box. It all is humorous now, but it wasn't funny at the time that it happened. Not everybody felt that way, but it was just, but what happened was Swami just told us exactly what I just said. And what happened was, we all realized that we had stopped asking what Master wanted us to do. I mean, I'm talking in a collective sense. We're just thinking about what we should do. And so basically the monasteries dissolved at that point. And mostly the monks and nuns married each other. Bingo, we had an instant householder community. It was very efficient. It was a little more traumatic than that, but not much. And then that woman turned out to be a catastrophe. She was very unpleasant, and we were extremely glad when she went away. I can say that because she really turned out to be a stinker, so I don't feel any need to protect her. But very shortly after that, Swami met this woman named, there was a group of charismatic Catholics in southern Italy, in Sorrento. And Swami had sent 2 devotees over to Italy, and they were starting a center in Rome. And this group of charismatic Catholics with their priest had read Autobiography of a Yogi, and they connected with our people in Rome. And so in November of 81, Swami went to Rome, and that whole group came there. And Rosanna Golea was one of the leaders of that group. The following spring, as it were, June, as it happened, I was with him. He went to Italy, and we reconnected with that group. By now, the other woman, thank God, was long gone. And Rosanna, we got off the train, and Rosanna linked arms with Swami, and a few years later, they married. So it was a wonderful time, because all of a sudden, how do I want to say it? Swami said he felt the Italians had something to learn from us, but we had much more to learn from the Italians, because he felt we were so inhibited in our ability to express devotion. And we were so worried, that we would become emotional or something like that. And as he put it, the Italians have put that one away a long time ago. And so they just really moved from the heart. And it really changed Ananda completely. And Rosanna came in, and then she brought some of her, the people, and we started to work in Italy. And the whole thing just It was just absolutely glorious. That group, they had they had a lot of music, and they would play music, and then they would just pray out loud, just, in the inspiration of the moment. They would just say prayers and then play the music spontaneously. And Rosanna did that. It wasn't talking in tongues. It was really just talking to God from your heart. And we'd never seen anything like it. And it was just so liberating for us. It was absolutely wonderful. And she would pray in Italian, which none of us spoke at that time. I mean, I still don't, but people do now. And then she would pray in Italian, and then Swami would translate it into English. I mean, it was just, and then meanwhile they're playing the guitar behind it. It was beautiful. So in the midst of all of that, Swami took Rosanna to Israel because they were so devoted to Jesus and she'd never been there. And actually Swami he'd never been on pilgrimage to those holy sites. He'd spent one day in Israel once. So he went with Rosanna to Israel. And he said much later, he said, of course he would have enjoyed the trip, but her devotion just made it even more so, because for her it was the answer to a dream to be able to be there. So they traveled through, just the two of them, through all the holy sites that were there. And then afterwards they went back to Sorrento, where she lived. And one morning, Swami, this was probably 1983, I think, he was thinking about the trip, and he was thinking, I'm not sure what the first one was. Does anyone remember? But anyway, he was thinking of one of the places that he'd been, and all of a sudden a melody came to him. And the melody communicated what he'd experienced there. And so he had a little tape recorder, and he sang it into the tape recorder or whistled it into the tape recorder, I'm not sure which. And then he thought, if I could get one melody, maybe I could get others. So I think as he put it, before he got out of bed that morning, he visited in his mind 20 of the sites and had received beautiful melodies that expressed the inspiration. And he was also working at that time. He thought maybe through that charismatic Catholic group, we could infiltrate the churches. Because he said, if for no other reason, they have all that real estate. So he thought if he could put his understanding of Jesus into music, then maybe that music would communicate the spirit of it, and you could skip all the theological struggles. He also saw it as a way to unify Rosanna's spiritual life in the group she was with Ananda, both of those things. So he had this little tiny Casio, or little keyboard, little electronic keyboard, a really small one, that he kept in his suitcase when he traveled, precisely because music would come to him. So he comes back, and he comes back to us, and he landed in San Francisco, and a group of us went to meet him. And we had a 5-story house, and we were renting. I used the royal we. There was an ashram, and meaning that anything about Ananda, I say we, whether I was there or part of it. But he had a room at the top of that house, and there was a group of us, maybe 10. And Swami pulls out this little thing, and he's so enraptured by this music that he's received, and this Oratorium is going to write. And he sits there and he says, and now here's the Holy Sepulcher. And it goes, ding, 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 ding. Isn't that wonderful, he says? And we all know, because we've worked with him before, you have to be supportive of his creativity, but you have to be sincere. It's not the time to say, are you kidding? So we all just kind of went, like that. Much later, after the whole thing was done, we were able to talk about that. And he said in his mind, when he hit those notes, he heard the choir, he heard the whole orchestra. It didn't sound to him like it sounded to us. But then he went home, and for 4 months, he just worked night and day on it, really constantly. And he started having heart trouble. he started having what is actually called congestive heart failure, which that's the medical term for it, because the heart begins to congest, and his limbs started swelling, he was short of breath, and he just wouldn't stop like that. And basically, the day he finished it, all the symptoms stopped. And he just said, Satan was trying to stop me. And then, as he was writing it, he was passing it out to the singers and to the musicians and to the choir, and then it was really a really wonderful time. And various of us would gather, and the best singers. Were you there, Dunbar? Were you living at the village, or were you living with us at that time? Yeah. And so they would sing it for him, and he almost never changed anything. Sometimes he'd change the words, and once in a while he'd change a note. Almost always it was because he'd miswritten it, because he just knew what it was supposed to be. And so then all of a sudden we had this whole thing about Christ. I mean, we'd always been celebrating Easter and Christmas because Master did, but most people did not really relate that much to Christ. We were more Indian. We were just into the Indian gurus, and Jesus was there, and that was nice, because there were two kinds of, not most, but the majority religions represented at Ananda were Jews and Catholics, for some reason. And the Jews, of course, had their reasons for not paying attention to Jesus, and the ex-Catholics had their reasons for not paying attention. And we were just more Indian. We were much more into that. But when Swami put this music in front of us, it was like all of a sudden it was vibrational. All of a sudden we had a vibration that was ours, that represented Jesus. And it began to just change the way we all felt about it, and it made him more real to us. It also, Swami led pilgrimage to India, and then a few other people led pilgrimages. I mean, a whole sort of thing started from that. And of course it made Rosanna feel more at home, with all of that. So, and what it did for me was my Jewish mother found out that I was a Christian, which she asserted I had not been before. I told her that I had always been, but, she thought I wasn't. Did I tell you? I didn't say this here. My parents were never part of Ananda, but they kind of they got the newsletters, and they just kind of wanted to know what their daughter was into. So my mother, I came home, came to visit them at one point, and this was now what the Oratorium is happening. And my mother, this was one of the few times they ever expressed, welcome. Nice to see you. This is Nicola's better half, Jorge. And my mother starts saying, because you can be anything and be Jewish except a disciple of Jesus. You can be a Tibetan Buddhist, you can do anything, but Jesus is the line in the sand. So my mother says, if only we had raised you in Judaism, because we weren't religious at all. If only we had raised you, if only we had brought you up, this wouldn't have happened. And I'm trying to reassure her by saying, oh, Mother, really, it's not it's just fine, there's nothing you could have done. I don't know what to say, because there's no link of philosophy. And so we go through this a couple of times, and then a voice in my head says, let her take the blame. And so I said, yes, Mother, if only. And as soon as I went there with her, we just suffered together for a brief period of time, and she never mentioned it again. Pardon me?
Did she take it with her?
I mean, did she die with it? It was uncharacteristic of my parents to be that concerned about whether we were Jews or not. I just think it was a flurry of something that went through her head. But it was also interesting. I learned a lot from that, Sometimes it's better to go with than to go against. But anyway, it was a very funny moment in my little personal history. And so that was my little personal experience with the Oratorium, too. And right after he sang that, the whole community learned it. We used to sing it just walking down the streets. We'd sing it in restaurants. It really, because we were now a little more Italian, we weren't so embarrassed about devotion. It was quite a moment. Are you bringing me a garbage can for my Kleenex? You're such a good girl. Thank you. Okay. Patrick, you haven't asked a question.
So, this is, I think, if people, I might sort of think this out loud a little bit. If people do things that offend us, or people do or say things that we find offensive.
Oh, people do or say things that we find offensive. Yeah. Oh, does that ever happen? Okay.
Or do things that we, I don't have any trouble expressing my opinion. And so it's just something I'm just having to be wondering about at the moment.
I mean, so how do you...
What do we use as a guiding principle for whether to give people feedback about the way they're behaving?
If people say things that you find offensive, the guiding principle is, what can I do that will be helpful? And sometimes it's helpful to me, helpful to yourself, and sometimes it's helpful to other people. You are not more important than the other people, but you are not less important either. You're all equal. That's what sometimes people don't understand. Martyring yourself to others is not necessarily a noble action, because if you're injuring yourself by doing that, you're not really helping. So what you have to really look at is there's this one and this one and this one and this one, and how do I balance all these, and which is the one to choose? So if you need to learn to speak your truth and not be intimidated from just simply saying what you know is true, and people are saying things that are extremely demeaning to you or to your beliefs, and your lesson is to speak up, then it may be the right thing for you to speak up. If it's better, if more good will be served by you learning to speak up than by you continuing to allow yourself to be squelched. If, however, you're quite good at expressing yourself, and there's nothing to be learned by you just telling everybody, how wrong they are, then the greatest good will be served by asking yourself, what will serve the person who's speaking? Or what good will it do if I speak? And so there's the guideline is, how can I serve when I include myself in that equation? It's just, I was in South Africa, and this man, it happened to be the end of the last program that we gave, and I must have had usually I'm quite energetic at that point, my blood sugar must have collapsed, which was very unusual, because as soon as everybody left, I sort of almost lay on the floor. But he starts talking to me about American politics with very completely well worked out and totally seamless conspiracy theories about a whole lot of things. And he spoke with great authority, and then he starts telling me, who actually lives in that country, all about what's going on and who's doing what to whom and how the American population feels and all these things. And the thought that's in my mind is, who the hell are you to be lecturing me about this? What is your source? But I looked at the man. First, I was too tired. Second, I just looked at the man and thought, there's absolutely no opening here. Why on earth would I waste my breath? He's utterly convinced. There's no question. In his conversation, there was not a question. It was total declarative sentences with an absolute fixed reality that I can't honestly say he was wrong, but I surely didn't think he was right. And I think he was exceedingly rude to be speaking to me the way he was, quite apart even from the context. But I thought, no good will be served by saying a single word. So I managed to be distracted by somebody next to me, and I just walked away. Let him do whatever he wants. There was nothing at stake for me. I don't care about American politics. I didn't have to argue conspiracy theories. I didn't have to defend myself. Like, you should respect me. I just gave a spiritual talk here. All these people came to hear me. I knew Swami Kriyananda. Who cares? I didn't have any of that at stake. Zero, none. So I could just look at him and think, you're not the slightest bit open to me. I think I won't waste my breath. Yeah. I think it would have been good for him to have somebody tell him how offensive he was being, but it wasn't going to be me.
How do you get, on that point then, can you speak more about how you sharpen the intuition? Because I am one of those who I have absolutely no problem speaking up, and so.
Well, there's a clue.
it's much more about being able to. I spend a lot of energy trying to work out, will something be served by me telling what I'm saying?
if you have an inclination to speak too much, then you have to start prejudicing your decision-making toward not speaking. So you have to start by thinking, I should only speak if I really feel to speak, because you've already said you have nothing to learn about speaking up. So, I mean, the first thing is so simple. Give yourself a little breathing room. You know, before you open your mouth, spend just a little time in quiet. And just train yourself to say, Master, what do you want me to do? Or you look at the person, you can pray to the person you're talking to. This is a very interesting part of it, because their soul knows what it needs. So sometimes, I didn't do this explicitly with that man. I'm looking at him, and I'm just sort of looking at him like, you know, what do you want me, I mean, really, literally, what do you want me to do? And it was quite clear, he wanted me to do nothing. And so why would I try to batter down his defenses? What point would there be in that? Because I had nothing to learn from it. So I've learned the question, you're asking the question, how do you have good judgment from experience? How do you get experience from bad judgment? Very simple. So what you do is you just mess up a whole lot of times, and then gradually you begin to see the pattern. But you start changing, you were talking about this here, when the perceived pain of redirecting my energy in a new direction, it seems less painful to change than it does to continue as I am. And that's a very subtle balance. No matter how painful it is to be who you are now, if it feels less painful to stay as you are than it does to put out the energy to be different, you will stay as you are. So you have to keep having the consequence of what you're doing prove wrong before you will begin to shift. And nobody can do that for you. But asking in silence, what do you want from me? What is your soul? Why are you standing in front of me? Why did God put you in front of me? Does it have anything to do with me? Or, can I be useful to you? And then sometimes very interesting things will come to you. And sometimes silence will come to you. But Swamiji had perfect self-control, which is, I never ever once saw him behave impulsively. He always behaved thoughtfully. It was an extraordinary example, no matter how much he was provoked. He was never compelled. He was always able to choose. And year after year after year, watching him be like that, I thought, now that's a very nice way to be. And then sometimes he was quite strong. He was no pushover. If it was appropriate, he would say what he wanted to say. But there was always that breath where he tuned in before he did it. Whereas I would hear myself speaking. That's how I would find out I was going to talk. And how did that work out for me? Not so well. Yeah. Yeah.
Dambara sang Swami's song, Yesterday I Live Without Fear.
Uh-huh.
And where he sings,
The dancers will pass, the singing must end.
I welcome the darkness with you as my friend. In the years, how did you see Swami build an absolute faith in Master, to have a complete...
This is one of the things about Swamiji and my perception, that actually I put this as the frontispiece on the book. I never saw Swami develop. I always felt him